Do you know anyone that you think is nearly a perfect person? Think about that. Now, try to think back to when you were a small child. Did you think anyone in your life was perfect? I did. I remember actually thinking, how could Jesus have been the only perfect person? I could not imagine my mother committing a sin or having ever committed a sin. Well, I got over that notion when I was a teenager and I was a Christian, and I thought that my mother didn't really understand grace at all. I thought I understood everything more perfectly than my mother did. Well, we're still in that list of Jesus' teachings that begin with, "You have heard that it was said," or "it has been said." Then Jesus says, "But I say," or "But I tell you." These continue through Matthew chapter 5, which ends with a really remarkable line. "Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect." This was not just given to my mother or to my teenager self. This is for everyone who listens to Jesus and accepts his authority. I would like to find some kind of caveat or some linguistic explanation. Maybe the word for perfect doesn't always mean perfect. Well, actually, that is true. The Greek word can mean perfect as without any flaw, or complete, or mature. Well, I don't find those alternatives helpful in this case. Be complete as your heavenly Father is complete. Be mature as your heavenly Father is mature. Our heavenly Father is actually perfect as without any flaw. That is something that we cannot ever claim to be. So I'm going to suggest another alternative shade of meaning that we might be able to wrap our minds around just a little bit better. How about the term "be consistent"? Or the term "be real"? I'm not trying to water it down. If this is right, Jesus is still saying be perfectly consistent and be real, but really be following my teachings and my example. As always, we should understand that Jesus is saying things using imperfect human languages and speaking to people whose mental capacities are far from perfect. We can't hold him to some kind of impossible standard when it comes to communication. He is a master communicator for sure, but we are not master listeners or thinkers. He has to make his points in ways that can work for those who have ears to hear, those who want to hear and understand and obey. But those are the people that Jesus is speaking to when he gives this instruction. Are we those people? So we've already heard him say that the goal is not just to refrain from taking vengeance on those who harm us, but to actually love them in spite of what they may do to us. And the goal is not just to refrain from adultery or divorce, but to actually love our husbands and wives. As we read on, Jesus applies this more complete, more mature, more perfect standard to honesty or integrity and generosity or empathy. There will be one more "you have heard that it was said" before concluding the list with that line, "Therefore be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect." We will save that one for next week. But let's look at Matthew 5, verses 33 through 37 to begin with. "Again, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, 'Do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows you have made.' But I tell you, do not swear an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make even one hair white or black. All you need to say is simply yes or no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one." Wow. That's a pretty strong statement. I don't know about you, but I used to think that almost everything Jesus said was completely unique to him. And everyone who heard him speak was hearing everything he said for the first time. Well, that's not the case. What was completely unique in his teachings was what he said about himself and what would happen to him and his followers. But Jesus did not claim to be teaching new truths or new realities. Rather, he brought truths that had already been delivered into focus. The principles that were behind all of the law and the prophets were meant to be understood all along. And rabbis discussed them and spoke about them constantly. What they did not do is apply them to themselves consistently. Maybe you remember what Jesus says later on in Matthew 23. Again, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, do not break. Maybe you remember what Jesus says later on in Matthew 23. It's a little bit confusing. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. So you must be careful to do everything they tell you, but do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. The Jewish teachers had always emphasized not just that telling the truth was important, it was an absolute obligation. Some of their sayings, for example, some rabbinic sayings, the world stands fast on three things: on justice, on truth, and on peace. Another saying, 4 persons are shut out from the presence of God: the scoffer, the hypocrite, the liar, and the retailer of slander. Another one who has given his word and who changes it is as bad as an idolater. Those are pretty strong statements. The school of Shammai, the very conservative rabbi that we mentioned last week, even said that it was forbidden to tell a bride how beautiful she was if she was really not so pretty. The rabbis were not against telling the truth. But then the practice of using oaths muddied the waters a bit. Even that started with the law. One of the 10 commandments is, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. You can find that in Exodus 20, verse 7. I'm using the language of the New King James Version there because we're familiar with that language when it comes to the 10 commandments. But we were most likely taught that this meant that we should not take it lightly or use God's name carelessly in our everyday speech. And no one in the Christian college community where I grew up ever said, oh God, or oh my God. And we certainly did not connect God with the word damn. That combination was even forbidden on television in America until it was used on LA Law in 1988. And it's still only used on live broadcast shows, just on PBS, not on the other networks, without it being bleeped. But it is pretty common now in comedy and drama shows, which is sad. However, that was not actually what the commandment was about. The commandment was about using God's name to swear an oath. Rather, it is talking about anyone who swears that something is true or makes some promise in the name of God, and they know it is not true, or they fail to live up to the promise made in God's name. But in the time of Jesus, there were 2 ways they were using oaths that were very bad. The first was using an oath when no oath was needed. They would introduce a statement by saying, by thy life, or by my head, or may I never see the comfort of Israel if. The rabbis even condemned this. They actually said, the yes of the righteous is yes, and their no is no. If that sounds familiar, it's because Jesus repeated it in this verse, and many of the versions of the Bible we grew up reading use those very words. The original NIV has Jesus saying, simply yet let your yes be yes, and your no, no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one. Now, that last line is a very strong statement. Why is this so directly connected with the evil one? Well, look at what Jesus says to some Pharisees who challenged him in John 8:44. He said, you belong to your father, the devil, and you want to carry out your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning, not holding to the truth, for there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks his native language, for he is a liar and the father of lies. So, using lying and deception is the devil's playbook. That's what he did from the very beginning. And look how that turned out for Adam and Eve. We could say that we might all still be in the garden walking and talking with God and feeling no shame if it weren't for the lies that they believed, right? Believing lies is bad enough, but using the devil's strategies and using lies is being a follower of Satan rather than a follower of Jesus. Instead of using Jesus' strategies to make life better, we are using the strategies of the enemy. The second way that oaths were being used in Jesus' time was what has been called evasive swearing. They actually used oaths to legitimize breaking their word. They were dividing oaths into two classes, those which were absolutely binding and those which were not. Any oath which contained the name of God was absolutely binding. Any oath which did not use or imply the name of God was held not to be binding. So if a man swore by the name of God in any form, he would absolutely keep that oath. But if he swore by heaven or by earth or by Jerusalem or by his head, he felt free to break that oath. Jesus said in our text in Matthew 5, "But I tell you, do not swear an oath at all, for it is God's throne, or by earth." But I tell you, do not swear an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make even one hair white or black. The idea behind the oaths in Jesus' day was that if God's name was used, God became a partner in the promise. But if God's name was not used, God had nothing to do with it. Jesus is saying that you really can't keep God out of any promise. Heaven is the throne of God. The earth is the footstool of God. Jerusalem is the city of God. A man's own head does not belong to him. He can't even make a hair white or black. His life is God's. There is nothing in the world which does not belong to God. And therefore, whether God is actually named in so many words or not does not matter. God is there already. When we lie, we are involving God in our lies. That's not a minor thing. We may think we can compartmentalize our lives and maybe be one person at home, another person at work, another person when we're having fun, and another person when we're at church or when we're doing anything religious, like reading our Bibles or praying. Well, God is always there. He is with us and in us, whether we use his name or not. A USA Today poll found that only 56% of Americans teach honesty to their children. And a Lewis Harris poll found that 65% of high school students would cheat on an important exam. So maybe it's not surprising. A doctor appeared on a network news show and said, "Lying is an important part of social life, and children who are unable to do it are children who may have developmental problems." There was a study conducted by two researchers from the University of Wisconsin and the University of Alabama that concluded that dishonesty was not as prevalent as they thought. They tracked the dishonest behaviors of over 630 participants for 3 months. The participants were asked to keep a daily journal of their deceptions, which resulted in a total of about 116,000 lies. Well, according to the researchers, about 3/4 of the respondents were regularly honest, what they called regularly honest, telling only 0 to 2 lies per day. A small group of 6% told more than 6 lies per day. Now, they also found people have good and bad days for lying. While there are some pathological liars, most people only tell lies as a result of specific circumstances. They thought this was good news because it was better than they expected. I had a friend who applied to become a police officer, and he failed the psychological exam. He was told that the reason was because he was asked if he had ever stolen anything. He said he had. He described his theft as stealing from his father because he worked at his father's gas station, which had an automatic car wash, and he would give his friends free car washes when his father wasn't around. The reason he failed the exam was not because he did that, but because he felt guilty for doing that. He was a Christian who felt guilty because he was guilty. That does not mean that he did not feel forgiven. It just meant that he wanted to live up to the promise we all make when we choose to follow Jesus. The world does actually place a very high value on honesty, but they don't believe that most people in most professions are honest, so they tend therefore to give themselves a break. This gives us an opportunity to make an impression when we are caught being more honest than others, a good impression. But we don't do that to please others, to make that good impression. Truthfulness is actually one way to show love for others, but we are truthful because we love God. So let's move on to the next. You have heard that it was said. You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand your coat over as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. The basic rule here is actually found in the Code of Hammurabi, which was written by Persians before the law of Moses was written. It's been called the oldest law in the world. It makes a distinction, interestingly, between aristocrats and common people. But other than that, it is very similar to the law of Moses that we find first in Exodus and 2 more times later on. The Code of Hammurabi reads, if a man has caused the loss of a gentleman's eye, his eye one shall cause to be lost. If he has shattered a gentleman's limb, one shall shatter his limb. If he has caused a poor man to lose his eye, or shattered a poor man's limb, he shall pay 1 mina of silver. If he has made the tooth of a man who is his equal fall out, one shall make his tooth fall out. If he has made the tooth of a poor man fall out, he shall pay 1/3 of a mina of silver. The law of Moses starts with the same eye for eye principle, but takes a different turn when it comes to how lower classes should be treated. It says, if there is serious injury, you are to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. It's in Exodus 21:23. Okay, that sounds like vengeance is not just allowed, but required. Well, if we read on, we'll notice the difference from Hammurabi's code when it comes to injuring someone of a lower class, the lowest of all, in fact. Look at this as we continue through verse 27 of Exodus 21. An owner who hits a male or female slave in the eye and destroys it must let the slave go free to compensate for the eye. And an owner who knocks out the tooth of a male or female slave must let the slave go free to compensate for the tooth. Okay, so the law of Moses was what we would call very progressive compared to other cultures. There was not exactly enforced equality. It wasn't the idea that everyone is the same and no classes at all were allowed, but mercy and forgiveness and generosity were instructed even for those who might have gotten themselves into a difficult place and become a slave or been in debt or might have been born into a poor household. And so that last line of Jesus' words, give to the one who asks you and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you, is another principle that was in the law of Moses. They were not just living up to the standard that God had laid out in that law. So look at these instructions from the law of Moses. Look at Deuteronomy 15. If anyone is poor among your fellow Israelites in any of the towns of the land your Lord your God is giving you, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted toward them. Rather, be open-handed and freely lend them whatever they need. Be careful not to harbor this wicked thought. The 7th year, the year for canceling debts, is near, so that you do not show ill will toward the needy among your fellow Israelites and give them nothing. They may then appeal to the Lord against you, and you will be found guilty of sin. Give generously to them and do so without a grudging heart. Then, because of this, the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and in everything you put your hand to. So the 7th year, they had to cancel their debts, so they didn't want to perhaps lend to anyone in that year because they knew that the debt would be canceled. But everyone had a chance to start over and not make the same mistakes again. And no one was forced to live in poverty because of bad business choices or bad luck or bad weather or some disease that affected them or their crops or herds. Now, this was not socialism where no one can ever be richer and everything is divided equally among everyone. Look at the last line. There will always be poor people in the land. Therefore, I command you to be open-handed toward your fellow Israelites who are poor and needy in your land. So prosperity is not the problem. Getting rich is not evil. Being greedy and failing to be generous and acting entitled as if you deserve more and are better than others is evil. Being rich or just having more than you need gives you the opportunity to love. If you have no choice to give, you have no choice to love in that way. It's even better if you have nothing extra, but you choose to share what you have anyway. Then it becomes not only an act of love, but an act of faith. Now, back to Jesus' words. Jesus is tying several things together that might not seem related. You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. Jesus ties together turning the other cheek when you're slapped, voluntarily giving someone who sues you more than you are legally required to, voluntarily going further than you're forced to go by someone who has power over you, and giving to those and giving or loaning to anyone who asks. Do those seem clearly related? What do they all have in common? It might seem like it's about non-resistance. Martin Luther King Jr. may have taken Jesus' words here as support for using Gandhi's methods to resist oppression and evil by not resisting using violence. And I would say that the principle did apply and it was effective. But Jesus is telling us to not even seek justice through non-violent means. He is telling us to turn justice upside down. If you give someone more than what they try to force you to give, you disarm their power over you. But we don't do that to exercise power over them. We do it out of love for them as God's children and faith in God's love for us. We prove God's existence by loving others as he loves us. One of the best thoughts I got out of the Bible lectures at Pepperdine this year, which was about love, is that love is the best apologetic. Apologetics is defined as reasoned arguments to justify something, such as the existence of God or the truth of the Bible. Well, you can argue that people of faith are not the only ones who show love, but the very idea of loving someone else without an agenda, without hoping to get something in return, comes from God, whether it's known or acknowledged or not. But when we love someone and we give God the glory because we know that he loved us first, no one can argue with that evidence for God's existence and his nature. You've seen pictures of these terraced rice paddies that are common in Asia. Most of them are worked by families who may only have one level, one terrace, and they have to irrigate that each day to keep the rice plants mostly underwater during the growing season, or they die. Watchman Nee was a Chinese evangelist who told about a Christian that he once knew in China who was a rice farmer. And every day that he went out and he pumped water into the paddies, his paddies of new rice, and every morning he returned to find that an unbelieving neighbor who had a field below his had opened the dikes in his field to let the water fill his own field. For a while, the Christian ignored it, but at last he became desperate because what should he do? His own rice would die if this continued, so how long could it go on? Well, he met with his fellow Christians and they prayed and they came up with this solution. The next day, the Christian farmer rose early in the morning and first filled his neighbor's fields. Then he attended to his own. Well, the neighbor became a Christian. His lazy and inconsiderate behavior was rendered powerless by the Christian. Followers of Jesus cannot be controlled by those who attempt to use them by exercising their deviousness or their positions of power or influence. It certainly does not always result in changing others like it did for this rice farmer, but every time we return love when others intend evil, our faith becomes more powerful. Amy Carmichael was a missionary who went to India in the 1800s and found that young girls were being exploited behind temple walls. And most people just ignored it. It was cultural. It was normal. But Amy refused to accept it. One by one, she began rescuing girls. She gave them a home. She became their mother. She told them about Jesus. And by the end of her life, she had taken in over 1,000 children. She once wrote, you can give without loving, but you cannot love without giving.